This is going to be a pretty challenging exercise, and it may seem like it's not going to be too difficult, but once you actually get inside of it, this is definitely going to be a little bit tougher than most of them. So what are we trying to do? Well, if you followed yesterday's exercise, you know that we built a way of processing an array and then grabbing the file names from that array. Well, I'm going to take a little bit different twist and look at that right now. And what I'm going to do is I want to grab an array. So we're going to be working with that same list of file names. But now, instead of just grabbing the files for one specific type of file format like Ruby or HTML, what I want to do is call a method on that array called file type mapper. And then what that's going to do is it's going to come down and it's going to generate a hash. It's going to return a hash where the first element or the key is going to be a string of the file type. So it's going to be RB, HTML, or JS for JavaScript. And then the value for each key is going to be the file names for that specific file type. So in other words, right here we have for RB, we have file 1, 3, and 4. And if you come up here, then you'll see that that matches. We have an RB file for file 1, then file 3 is RB, and then file 4 is RB. And then we do the same thing for HTML and JavaScript. Now this is a little bit challenging, especially when you think of how you can do this in the most elegant manner possible, which in this case I think is going to be to use an enumerator, and that is kind of the solution that I think is best. But I'm definitely interested to see what others have come up with as well. So right here, I am going to open up the array class, and you're going to need that to do that in order to pass the test because we're calling file type mapper. So I'm going to define that method of file type mapper. It doesn't take any arguments because it is simply going to be called on that instance of the array class. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage the each with object enumerable method. So this is different than each, it's different than map, and so what this is going to do, it's going to let us to iterate over, but it's going to allow us to pass in an object that we can use. So whenever you have a situation like this, where you have an array, but then you need to change it into a different data type, such as this, where we want to return a hash. There are a number of ways to do it. You could create a hash at the top of the method here. So I could say something like hash and then hash.new. And you could do it that way. But when you use each with object, you can actually do that on the fly, which is very handy. Now that's one thing that I want to do, and so I'm going to pass in a call because the default argument here, when you pass it in, that is the object that you're going to be able to work with. Now, if you just try to do inside of this, if you just try to do something like hash.new, this is not going to work. And it's because we're working with a kind of trickier type of set of requirements. So not only do we need to have a new hash, a hash by itself would work if these elements or the value here was not going to be an array, but because it is, we need to actually start off the object and let the hash know that, hey, your values should be empty arrays by default. So how do you do that? Well, let's actually come down, and I'm going to let me comment this out, and so that we're not going to get an error when we try to process this. But whenever you want to create a hash, an empty hash that is going to have a set of values to start off with, or I should say a structure, you can do it like this, where you say hash new and then pass in a block. So I'm going to pass this in, and then the two elements for the block variables are going to be h and then k. And so this is going to be the hash, and then the first one's going to be the hash value, and then the key is, there the k is going to be the key. And then from there, I'm going to pass in, not a empty hash, an empty array, and then I can close it out with this hash. So now let's see exactly what this returns. So if I run this code, and then come down all the way to the bottom, you can see it returns an empty hash, which is the exact same thing if we did hash new. So what's the big deal? Well, if I do age and then pass in, some key, just like this, and then from here, I want to, let's just use a pipe. So here, I'll just pass in the value 1. And if I run this, you can see that, look at that. That passed in that value, and it passed it in as an array, even though I didn't explicitly force that to happen. It just happened automatically. And now if you come here, you can see that some key has the value of an array instead of just a integer, which it would have been if we wouldn't have performed this default kind of setting here. And this also allows us to do things like this now, where this wouldn't have been possible before. But if I come here and say some key and then pass in 2, this is going to pipe that in, and then it's going to add that to the array. So now the value is going to be an array of 2 elements. This is the trickiest part of the entire build, is being able to create a hash that already has a default structure. So I definitely recommend kind of getting familiar with this, because this is a pattern that I find that I follow quite a bit. So let's now come up and we can actually use it now. So instead of this hash value, I'm going to be able to use this structure. And let me come back and just get rid of these sample values. Okay, so now when I pass each with object in this hash creator, this is going to now give us a structure that we need. So we are all good. And now let me come down and delete our sample data. And now we can continue building this out. So each with object, if you've followed along in other guides, I use it quite a bit. And so it takes a block, and the first item in the block is going to be the element that we're iterating over. So in this case, it's going to be the file or the file name. So that's going to be what I call the first block variable. You could call it anything, but I like these to be descriptive. And the next thing it's going to pass in or have access to is the hash. And so and this is part of the reason why I absolutely love each with object, because you're able to pass in this hash. So this hash that's being created is going to we're going to have access to this inside of this block variable. So that is very handy whenever you're trying to build objects. Next thing that we need to do is we're going to grab the file extension. I'm going to show you another way of being able to do it as opposed to just using regular expressions. And that comes with the core Ruby library, and it's in the file class. There's a method called extName. So ext name. We're going to pass a file to it. And just in case you're wondering what this does, we can test it down here. So if I say file.extName and then pass in file1.rb, now if I run this on line 23, this is going to grab that file extension, including the period. So that is pretty awesome, because that's exactly what we're looking to do. Now in yesterday's guide, I showed you how to do that using a regular expression, but there are times where you may just want to use the core Ruby library. Now because we have that, we can come in and now we can use kind of a slicing technique and say 1 to -1, and that is going to remove the file name from or I should say it's going to remove the extension from that file. So that's going to be a very helpful process. And if you want to test that out yourself, then we can come down here and perform the exact same process. So 1.1. If we run this code now, you can see that this is going to take the dot, and now we have the extension just by itself. So that's just kind of a helpful way of cleaning it up, removing the period. So we're going to be able to work with the file extension and the file name by themselves without the dots. Because if you look through the test data, and I think in most normal situations, you are not going to need that dot there. So it's kind of like some data cleanup. Now, the next thing we're going to do, and this is actually the last thing we need to do to get this working, is now we are going to add to the hash. So first, I'm going to call hash, and then the file extension, because remember, the file extensions are our keys. So I'm going to say hash file extension, and then I'm just going to say hash file extension, and then push. Now, if you remember what push does, push takes an element and adds it to an array. It's a very similar process to when we were using the shovel operator. And from there, I can say file, chomp, and then pass in and pull out, I should say, the dot and the file extension. Okay, let's see if this works. I believe this is everything needed for the solution, but we need to test it out even before we do the test. So let's see, I have file names, and now if I want to call file type mapper on this, let's run it and see if this gives us what we want. And yes, it does. So that is working. We have a hash now that gets returned, and it has summarized our entire set of file names. We have RB, and it contains the file names for that in an array. HTML, same thing. JavaScript, same thing. So this is pretty neat. And if you're wondering about some of these methods, so right here we are setting the file extension. We're saying that we want to add a new element to it, and so that's what we're pushing. And then here, this is just some string manipulation. So I'm saying file.chomp, and so what this is going to do is it's going to slice this up. It's going to, as a first argument, it's going to take in the dot plus the file extension, and that's all we need to do. Now, part of this, the reason why we needed to add that dot was because we removed it up here. So just in case you're wondering why we needed to do that, technically we could just call that file.xname, pass in the file, and it would do the same thing. But since we already removed it, we needed to do it there. But this does everything we need. But before we end this, let's run the test to make sure we're not missing any edge cases. So rspec March 17th, running that. One example, no failures. So this is passing the test. It is working, and you now know how to create a file type mapper in Ruby.